Welcome to her remarkable history. Remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. The horrific afterlife of Catherine Howard. Catherine Howard was the 5th Queen to Henry VIII. She lost her life for committing adultery against the king, both before her marriage and supposedly during. But Catherine was still just a child, and her death was brutal, heartbreaking, and unnecessary. But today, we're not looking at why Catherine died. Instead, we're looking at the day of Catherine's execution, and then what happened to her afterwards. So please join us today to look at the horrific afterlife of Catherine Howard, and to support our channel, please subscribe. Catherine would learn that her execution was scheduled for 7 a.m. on Monday the 13th of February, 1542. She was told to dispose of her soul and prepare for death, for she was to die at 9 o'clock the next morning. The night before her execution, Catherine spent hours praying. She is also thought to have practised placing her head onto the block. According to Eustace Chapuis, Catherine requested that the block be brought to her so that she might know how to place herself. Her request was granted, and the block was brought into her chamber. Then, on the morning of February 13th, Catherine woke early and made her way out of the apartment she was imprisoned in and towards the scaffold that had been erected for her execution. It is said that Catherine approached, and she was terrified and pale. Catherine was petrified of what was coming next, so much so that she needed help climbing the stairs. Once on the scaffold, Catherine was so weak that she could hardly speak, but she said that she had merited 100 deaths for so offending the king who had so graciously treated her. It is also said that she then asked for all Christian people to take regard unto her worthy and just punishment with death, for her offences against God, and heinously from her youth upwards in breaking all of his commandments, and also against the king's royal majesty very dangerously. There is a rumour throughout history that states the following. When Catherine was on the scaffold, she said, "I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpeper." Now Catherine was so weak that she struggled to speak. The fear had overtaken her. The executioner then gave Catherine a blindfold which she placed over her eyes. Then, as Catherine had practised the night before, she knelt down and placed her head onto the block. There was a large crowd there to witness her death, and as the executioner raised the extremely sharp axe, they gasped. Then, with one swift blow, the executioner struck Catherine's neck and removed her head from her body. It was at this point that the executioner picked up Catherine's head by her hair and removed her blindfold. He held up her head to the crowd and showed her lifeless face and proclaimed, "God save the King." Catherine was then taken by her ladies, after being covered with a black cloak, to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where she was then laid to rest. Now this chapel was built in the Tudor period, and it houses some dark and brutal truths about the history of the era. Inside the chapel not only lays the remains of Catherine Howard, but also Anne Boleyn and Lady Jane Grey, all queens, and all executed, and all wronged by others in power. But queens were not the only people to suffer at the hands of the Tudor monarchy. Within the chapel also lies the remains of many more victims, of whom lost their lives. But it's within this chapel that secrets are unearthed, and Catherine's story does not end with her murder at the behest of King Henry VIII. Instead, the truth is far more sinister. You see, even before she died, Catherine was treated in ways that showed the king had no love for her. If you compare her death to that of Anne Boleyn's, although both are brutal, Anne was allowed a swift death via means of a French swordsman, but Catherine was beheaded via a blunt axe. The scaffold for Anne was covered in velvet and expensive fabrics, whereas Catherine's was only covered in straw and hay to soak up her blood. Catherine wasn't even given a cushion to kneel on, and she also didn't die a queen, for her titles were stripped from her before she even left Hampton Court Palace. Catherine's ladies-in-waiting covered her body up in black cloth, and took it inside the chapel to bury her. But there was no pomp or ceremony, and no arrow chest for her to be buried inside of. Catherine was thrown into a grave, with no funeral, and then left. But you would think this would be the end for the poor girl, but that's just not the case. What happened next was sadistic and inhumane. It is alleged that when she was buried and wrapped in the cloak, that a rather sparing and liberal amount of quicklime was shovelled into her grave. It's alleged that Henry VIII ordered this, and the effects of this is that the quicklime would have dissolved her body and remains to virtually nothing. Almost as if someone wanted nothing of Catherine Howard to remain on earth, or as if the king wanted her erased from his mind, memory and history, as if she never existed in the first place. But then, in the era of Queen Victoria, the chapel where Catherine is buried became the focus of renovations. Queen Victoria was alarmed to find that the chapel was being used as a meeting room. And as Victoria was dead against this, she ordered the restoration of the building. Large amounts of improvements were made to the small church, as Victoria felt the place was not fit for purpose, nor was it appropriate for the burial of royalty or other high-born individuals who rest there. It was during these renovations that the floor required lifting, and the builders found they needed to exhume the bodies of the souls who lay near the altar and the high chancel. The bodies of those who were executed inside the Tower of London's walls were exhumed and identified. Doctors managed to identify Anne Boleyn's body and many more, including that of Margaret Pole and Lady Rochford, who was beheaded shortly after Catherine Howard. After these bodies were identified, they were carefully placed into boxes and moved for safekeeping whilst the renovations took place. However, what puzzled the builders is the fact that no remains could be found that pointed towards Catherine Howard's. It was thought that she was buried close to the high altar, such was her position in society. As usually in churches, the most important burials are under the altar or close to it, but Catherine Howard's remains could not be found, and because of this it points to the idea that she was covered in quicklime after her execution. Now close to where Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, remains were located, a number of bones were found that had been eroded by lime, but these could not be linked to Catherine Howard, so her body was not one which could be identified during the Victorian renovations inside the chapel. The renovations uncovered hundreds of remains, many of incredible, influential people, such as Thomas More or John Fisher. Sadly, Catherine's remains have never been found still to this day, but inside of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, next to the resting place of Anne Boleyn, Catherine's cousin, lays a plaque that displays her coat of arms and reads her name. Quicklime is an incredibly strong chemical that, if used on poor Catherine's body, would have sped up the process for her decomposition. It's heartbreaking to think that Catherine, who was only a young girl at the time of her death, was a victim of the brutal and notorious King Henry VIII. And although she should not have had the relationship with Thomas Culpeper, it was clear that she had more in common with the courtier than that of the grotesque king she was married to. It was the Victorians who gave backing to the theory that Catherine's remains were covered in quicklime, but some historians do suggest that her body may have been misidentified as Anne Boleyn's. Catherine's life was horrendous, sad and brutal, but her death and her treatment after death can only be described as heinous, horrifying and despicable. The memorial marker in the chapel is just a memorial to the once Queen Consort, but the truth is that, although Catherine's body was never found, she could somewhere within the floor of the church be resting in a place still unearthed. Now Catherine met her end at the hands of an axeman, at the behest of a tyrant king, and she was only around 18 or 19 years of age at the time. She was a girl with such potential, if only she had never met the king. But the marriage that she found herself in proved to be a solidifying factor in the creation of Catherine as a tragic victim at the hands of evil. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.